Okay, going on to slide number 15. So this is the front and back cover. It's kind of cute. It's illustrative. It's the front and back cover of a book about Lee Kuan Yew, an approved book in Singapore that plays up the image of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who was a lawyer in London, used to go by the name of Harry Lee. I think I might have already mentioned that. And he became the leader of the Political Action Party. So take a look at the things that are written on the front and the back. Notice the imagery on the front about riding the tiger. The idea here, of course, is that Lee Kuan Yew was very clever and was able to do something that most people could never do, which was ride the tiger of communism. He wasn't actually a communist, but he ended up turning to the right when he became the national leader of Singapore. And we've already gone through most of that, so I won't dwell on it. Go on to slide 16. So the man pictured here at the top, he has the most interesting laugh, I would say, but anyway, he is the son of Lee Kuan Yew, Lee Hsien Loong. He's known as BG Lee, BG standing for Brigadier General, because he had a career in the Army and reached that rank. He intends to stay in office for a long time. He's been in office for almost 20 years now, and 2016, 2017 maybe is when he will give it up. But after Lee Kuan Yew stopped being the Prime Minister and moved on to be the Senior Minister, the man behind the curtain in Singapore, he put a fairly gray, colorless individual named Goh Chok Tong into the Prime Ministership, whose job was to just continue the policies of Lee Kuan Yew until BG Lee was old enough and ready in, I think it was 1994 or 90. No, I got it wrong. 97, 98, something like that is when BG Lee took over. So it's a bit of a dynasty. I don't know if there are any successors in the wings, like in North Korea, but they did a good job for all of the undemocratic nature of Singapore's society. I once had a conversation with a policeman in Singapore about something that we were working on together when I was a corporate investigator, and I asked him, what if this gets into the press? And he laughed and said something along the lines of, don't worry about them. We can keep them under control. The press in Singapore is interesting. It's like reading a paper in a communist country, except that there aren't the slogans. There's just the fawning approval of everything that the government does, with a lot of announcements from the government, that sort of thing. It's a very nice place to visit, though. It's very clean. It's developed, as I say, it was one of the tigers or dragons. It's developed very well over the years. And with plenty of growth, it's become the financial center for Southeast Asia. It's a Chinese city. I don't have the precise statistics, but basically it's about 70% Chinese and perhaps 15% Malay and 15% Indian. Chinese dominate most of the professions, but not entirely. You can still make it as a Malay or as an Indian in Singapore in the professions, as long as you've got the smarts. The court system is very interesting. Whenever there's an ordinary case, then the court system works very well, and it's very impartial. When there is a case involving a political figure that's in opposition to the government, though, then he or she can kiss a goodbye. The judiciary is not the judiciary is independent, but not that independent. Singapore and Malaysia share a legacy from the British colonial period of the Internal Security Act, which operated in both places because, of course, they used to be one colony, more or less. And they were one country, as I mentioned, from 1962 to 1965 until the Malays booted out the Singaporeans. And the Internal Security Act allows for the detention of any individual for reasons related to preserving public peace. And traditionally that's been connected with offenses that would offend or threaten domestic harmony, usually something having to do with relations between the ethnic groups. But I've seen the ISI used in both places to detain people up to 2 years without charges for other crimes, including property theft of various sorts, particularly important ones, not just a burglary, but something like a hijack. Going on to slide 17, so one of the reasons that the Internal Security Act was thought up by the British and continued to be implemented by both governments in Malaysia and Singapore is that there is no love lost between the different ethnic groups. That's the most modern reason, but there was also the guerrilla movement that I think I've mentioned previously that prompted the Malayan emergency of the 1950s. That guerrilla movement did very well in the post-war period up through the mid to late 50s, and then it was defeated. And as I mentioned in a previous week, it was defeated by rounding up all the Chinese in the countryside, not in the cities, but in the countryside, and putting them into villages that were surrounded by barbed wire and guards who were not Chinese, in order to isolate the Chinese minority from the communist guerrillas who were mostly Chinese. And that defeated them. And the U.S. tried to use that tactic in Vietnam, but they were dealing, of course, with a different ethnic balance. They were dealing with a Vietnamese population that was everybody, and that didn't quite work. This whole strategic Hamlet's thing. And then in the 1960s, now Malaysia was just a couple steps behind these other dragons or tigers, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Cheap manufacturing moved in the 1960s. There were policies to promote education of the populace, universal education, and there were pro-business policies that allowed foreign manufacturers to come in and grow. One of the most prominent was Intel. Intel went in there in 1968 when the company was only 2 years old, or maybe I've got that slightly wrong. Maybe it was 1970 when the company was 2 years old. I think that's right. And set up a factory in Penang, a Chinese city, in western Malaysia's northwest. Penang is an island and has an adjacent area on the mainland right across a bridge. And they did very well. And the founding of the Intel plant in Penang led to other businesses going in, other foreign businesses going in and making other electronics and other manufactured goods, which spawned, as I mentioned previously, happened in other countries, which spawned a middle class that was educated and pro-business and supported the government, and it all worked out very well. The ethnic tensions, unfortunately, the ethnic tensions were maintained through the years. When you get a group of people together in a room, let's say you're an American, and you're together in a restaurant with a group of Indian friends in Malaysia, if they trust you, they will start to complain about the Chinese, and the same is true of a group of Malays or a group of Chinese. Amongst younger people, there is more of a tendency to hang out in multi-ethnic groups. Among people, however, who are middle-aged, that tendency is not so evident. Let's go on to slide 18. Indonesia, a very different case, partly because it's a larger country spread out over a lot of islands. The distance between the western end of Indonesia and the eastern end of Indonesia is roughly the same distance as between Honolulu and Tokyo. It's an enormous country with tens of thousands of islands. And because of this, development has never been easy. And Indonesia is also, although everybody is of the same ethnic stock, that is, they are Melanesians, they look like Filipinos because they too are of the same ethnic stock. There are still different ethnic groups split by culture and language in Indonesia. The same language that is taught as the language of the classroom, beg your pardon, that's taught in schools in Malaysia, which is called Bahasa, is also taught in Indonesia. In Indonesia, it's Bahasa Indonesia. In Malaysia, it's Bahasa Malaysia. The word Bahasa simply means language. This is the dominant language of the region, but there are many others. So things have reached the point where almost everybody speaks Bahasa in both countries. You can tell somebody's from Indonesia or Malaysia by their accent, by their word usage as well. The majority is Muslim in Malaysia. There is a distinct minority of Buddhists, Hindus rather, and there are some Buddhists. On the island of Bali, a very popular tourist destination, which contains some ancient ruins, and there are ancient ruins elsewhere in Indonesia from societies that were contemporaries of the kingdoms of Cambodia about 1,000 years ago. There is occasional violence between these different groups. There's been a long-standing independence movement in Indonesia out in the west, in Aceh, and as we will explore in a moment when we turn to Australia, there's also a newly independent country called East Timor, which used to be the Portuguese colony. That Australia has a big stake in keeping independent because it gives them a foothold in that part of the world, which is right close to their part of the world. The Chinese minority occasionally is assaulted en masse by Indonesians who do not trust them. If you have a chance to see the movie Year of Living Dangerously that is posted on D2L, you will learn a bit about how China was sponsoring or assisting a potential coup d'etat against the military by the PKI, the Parti Komunis Indonesia, in 1965, and ultimately that failed because the Indonesian military caught wind of it. And so Chinese have not been trusted. You may recall maybe 4 weeks ago I mentioned that China at the Bandung Conference held in Indonesia in 1955 had made a statement saying that all ethnic Chinese in places like Indonesia were not Chinese citizens, they were Indonesian citizens. But after 1965, the distrust of ethnic Chinese by the Indonesian majority was such that all Chinese, besides many of them being killed in the counter coup that followed these years of living dangerously by Sukarno, a lot of all Chinese had to change their names. They had to change their names from being distinctly Chinese to being they were Bahasa-ized, you might say. They were changed into words that were from the Bahasa language, although they carried the same meanings as the Chinese. There was a whole official effort to get this done. And now you go to Indonesia, you meet ethnic Chinese business people, and they have Indonesian names, although you can sort of tell. If you know enough about Bahasa, you can detect that this is a Chinese name. If you've ever looked into a pair of running shoes, it's highly likely that you'll see a Made in Indonesia label inside. Indonesia is a center for light manufacturing, and there is talk of Indonesia being one of the next Chinas. Not that any country will ever take the place that China held up until a few years ago as manufacturing center for the world, and that they still really hold. But in 10 years, it's likely that Indonesia and a string of other countries, including Burma, Vietnam, some countries in Africa, will inherit a great deal of the light manufacturing that has been going on in China on behalf of foreign companies. And some of that, of course, is already going on in Indonesia. Why have they been hobbled in their development? This is a question that troubles many people, and I'm no expert on it. I can only observe that there are several factors that certainly must play into the hobbled development of Indonesia. The most prominent is corruption, and this is an endemic corruption. It is more than just a cop on the beat taking an apple from a cart for free. It's more than gangs extorting small business people. To get anything done in Indonesia, to get a phone, to get your mail forwarded, whatever you want to pick, you have to pay a bribe. The same thing is true in a lot of other countries in the region, and I'm not saying that Indonesia is necessarily the worst, but partly I would say it is that the writ, that's W-R-I-T, the writ of the central government does not really extend very far amongst local officials. I don't think they have their local officials under control. They're allowed to do almost anything they want. The military exerts a centralizing influence, and the reason the military exists is not to really so much to defend Indonesia against outside powers as it is to force the country to stay together, because there are several parts of Indonesia that would like to, where the local populations would like to split away and have their own country. So that's, like I say, I'm no expert on Indonesia, but these are some of the obvious reasons why development has been held back. Another one is that the education system is not very good. Although there are universities in Indonesia, they have not been used to educate the public as widely, nor have the middle schools, as widely as in Malaysia. The police are much less reliable in Indonesia than they are in Malaysia. The army is much more involved in politics. They're not involved in politics at all in Malaysia. In Indonesia, the military is a central player in politics, and that means, of course, that development priorities are more likely to be hijacked by the military than they will be to assist development in minority areas, let's say, the kind of thing that would promote economic development and lower ethnic tensions. Those things are second in Indonesia. So I think that these factors at least take a few steps in the direction of explaining all this. Okay, now we'll switch topics. I want to try to bring us up to speed on the Australian side concerning how Australia has interacted with Asia in the most recent 20 years to the present day. We'll continue on slide 19.